deploying with VMware solutions. Just give me 1 second. My slide's not advancing for some reason. There we go. Yeah, so I wanted to briefly cover the history that Genetec has with the virtual environment. You know, we do have a long history of deployments in this space. How Security Center pairs well with Converged. So, you know, not just the history that we already have, but also how the two technologies really do complement each other very well. And when you're building with Security Center and now with Converged infrastructure, you're really going to get the best in breed from both the software and the infrastructure. And then finally, the benefits of Converged infrastructure as we see them. So as I see the benefits of Converged infrastructure, how it can improve operations, it can improve the availability of the system, as well as the management of the system. So our history with our first virtual deployments go all the way back to the Omnicast 4 days. Some of you might remember that being all the way back to 2004. So it's a very long history. In fact, our first direct engagement as an engineering company with VMware date back over 10 years. So we have more than a decade of direct engineering support between our Genetec engineers and VMware VMware engineers. So there's a lot of collaboration there, which means that we're really, you know, making sure our products play well together. On top of that, EMC and VMware have labs. They have a couple labs where they have thousands of Genetec demo licenses, which they use to test. VMware and EMC, of course, now being part of Dell Technologies. So they have been testing their products with our solutions for a long time. So when you combine those technologies into this hyper-converged infrastructure that we're now deploying in security, you're going to see that the products really do complement each other very well because of that long history. And then finally, we're not new to the virtual environment. Genetec's customer base has long been having this as a requirement. So we've been deploying with VMware solutions for a very long time. Now we're just, you know, internalizing a lot of those solutions, having BCD create a product that really makes it intuitive and easy to deploy. That does bring up the question, though, is Genetec well suited for the virtual environment? And I think it's pretty obvious that it is a very well-adapted product. So we have a role-based architecture within Security Center, which means we're very flexible. If you need to spin up a new role like mission control, for example, say your security requirements change and now you need to really adapt quickly to those requirements, you can spin up a new role and be up and running with those without doing a re-architect of your whole system. What this VM solution allows you to do is abstract that hardware. So instead of needing to add a piece of hardware to spin up another archiver, to spin up an analytics role, to spin up a mission control role, you can just spin up another VM. Provided there's resources available within your virtual infrastructure pool, you don't have to worry about adding hardware, which means much faster times to react to any issues that you might be seeing. So how does converged infrastructure work in a security deployment? I think there's quite a few things that it really does add benefit to. So there's a lot to the converged infrastructure that on its own is a very important tool to have in your data center. But specific to the security industry, I think there's 3 real keys that really make it a great technology to be adopting. One of them is operations management. So I'll cover a little bit what I mean by that, but really it's about taking what's necessary from the security management as well as the infrastructure management and combining those items together so you have a much better picture of what's going on in your environment. There's also system availability. Genetec as a software prides itself on being very available and having tools in there like failover to make itself as available as possible. But now if you're going to be building on top of a converged infrastructure as well, it's bringing another class of availability to that whole deployment. And finally, lifecycle management. I think every end user and integrator on the call today can say, you know, upgrades are difficult. Managing the lifecycle of a security deployment is not easy. And these technologies here can really help improve that lifecycle management of the system. So when we're talking operations management, It really does complement a lot of the features that Genetec has already built into its product. So we have put a lot of management tools in Security Center to help you manage the security aspect of any deployment. But the IT industry has a very long history, and VMware specifically within that IT industry, they have a very long history of troubleshooting IT problems, and they've built a lot of tools. They have a wealth of tools that might be somewhat new to the security operations team, but if we can leverage those tools using converged infrastructure, we can get much more visibility into the network. So you can stop managing your security infrastructure as individual servers, but you start to manage them as a pool of resources. So it allows a lot more flexibility. It allows for a lot more adaptability in the way you respond to new threats. So when I talk about monitoring tools, I'm talking about things like networking. You can monitor latencies, you can monitor storage, you can monitor generally the server hardware, the compute. That's traditionally monitored. It's traditionally either not always monitored, or it's monitored at the individual system level. But now, when you tie everything together, you get a much better sense for how the entire environment is doing. So things like networking, if you start to experience higher latencies, instead of reacting to that by saying, you look in the system availability monitor and you see like, okay, you're losing, cameras are dropping offline, or you might start losing packets or something like that. Instead of being reactive once if the problem has already impacted the security deployment, you can use the converged infrastructure to monitor latencies and see proactively, oh, my latencies have gone above a certain threshold. I need to respond to that before it has an impact on my actual security deployment. And another thing that I think most of you should be familiar with or might be familiar with is Security Center Federation, which is one of the key features for us on enterprise projects, which allows us to really scale the security deployment. It makes it easy to manage tens of thousands of entities within a system. And with converged infrastructure, you can manage the security deployment or the infrastructure deployment in the same way. So while Security Center allows you to manage all of those entities, this converged infrastructure will allow you to manage all of the underlying hardware as well. That gives you much better visibility into the system if anything's going wrong, if there's persistent threats that are starting to appear. It also gives you visibility into the maintenance and makes it easier to manage maintenance centrally. So it's taking a complementary concept of management and applying it to that underlying infrastructure. And that's what I mean from the operations side, how converged infrastructure can really complement the Security Center software. System availability, I think we can all agree, is of the utmost importance for a security deployment. And we, in the software side of Genetec, have put a lot of work into system availability, making sure that cameras are always available, making sure there's failover, making sure that you can retrieve archived video, making sure that your access control system is always online and fault tolerant. Same thing on the LPR side and the communication side. And through and to that end, we've put a lot of tools in. So we have maintenance tools in the system for you. We have the Genetec update service to help you make sure that all of your entities are up to date and the firmware is good. On the firmware side, we have the firmware vault. So we make it easier for you to maintain the system. And the goal there is to make sure that the system is online as much as possible. And what you can do now with the converged infrastructure aspect of it is take that same philosophy and bring it to the infrastructure level. So instead of just having, all the software working to keep all of the individual security entities online, you've now an extra layer of protection, which is there to keep the individual virtual machines within the deployment online as well, bringing the HA of the system to a much higher level. Another big benefit of the converged infrastructure when you're looking at it as a pool is instead of needing a one-to-one redundancy ratio to get fault tolerance into a system, you can start to operate with more hardware efficiency. So instead of needing 10 primary archivers and 10 failover archivers, you can probably get away with 10 primary and 2 failover nodes in the VM farm, getting you much more efficiency out of each piece of equipment that's deployed. And then on top of that, you're getting that fault tolerance of the converged infrastructure. So again, it's taking a lot of the core components of the security deployment and a lot of the core values of Genetec and applying that same principle to the infrastructure that Genetec is running on. On the lifecycle management, I mentioned up top, lifecycle management can be a big pain for a lot of deployments. So that's, going through the process of replacing and upgrading hardware, maintaining it, making sure that the firmware is up to date, going through the process of upgrading the software. All of these can be big pain points. And at Genetec, we're looking at different ways that we can reduce those pain points, but there's also a lot that this converged infrastructure can bring to it. So for example, you need to upgrade a node. It's pretty clear, instead of having to do a manual upgrade and replace a physical node with another, you have to replace the physical node, but instead of having to do it on an individual system basis, you can just migrate all of the VMs on the node that needs to be retired onto the new node. And then once there's nothing running left on that original node, and once all the retention is gone, then you can just retire that node from the deployment, remove it. And it's really a seamless way to upgrade your hardware. Keep your system online, keep it up to date, and keep it running the latest technology so that it can adapt to any needs. And we can apply a similar principle to the software upgrade as well. So traditionally, if you ever have to roll back a software update, it can be a very painful process. It can be difficult, and it can be really time consuming. When you're dealing with a system like this, a converged system, you take a snapshot of your VMs before you do any upgrades. So when you do an upgrade, if anything goes wrong, you can roll back that snapshot. It's a much smoother process, and it can save the integrator a lot of time, and it can save the end user a lot of downtime. So preventing that downtime. Another principle, that's something that isn't Genetec's not perfectly suited to it today, but it is a philosophy that we're working towards on the engineering side of the software, is the concept of VM hydration. So instead of doing an upgrade from a VM running 5.8 and upgrading that VM to 5.9, you can just create a new VM in parallel that's running a fresh instance of 5.9 and then hydrate that VM with all of the entities. Again, this is future looking. It's not somewhere we're at today, but it's something that if you're deploying a converged infrastructure today, you're future-proofing for when that technology is available. So in summary, how virtualization and converged infrastructure can really help a security deployment. Virtualization is the foundation for a scalable solution density. So you can add and scale your system very quickly. And the density there is referring to the fact that you don't need a one-to-one failover. You can get much more efficiency. You can get more roles and more redundancy from less equipment overall. Then you have orchestration and automation. So this is deploying new systems, and you can automate the deployment of those systems. So if you're talking about, I have a directory VM and I have an archive VM, you can have different settings for those ones, and you know how to deploy those quicker. Then you have monitoring dashboards. These are tools that you've heard Jeff already mention to them. Harmonize. There's other ones that are going to end up being integrated into Security Center, so that you end up with a nice, easy to view management pane, and it might not have all the features you need to deploy your virtual environment, but it'll warn the security operator that something needs to be done in another pane of management. You have the diagnostics tools, which I mentioned previously. So that's stuff like network latency, storage. If you're starting to run out of resources, you can get that proactive response so that you're not being reactive, but you're being proactive in your maintenance of the system. And then finally, you have your analytics. Your analytics here, if all of your data is pooled together, then it's much easier to adapt to a problem. So if your data is in one location, and for example, you're a retail store that needs to all of a sudden keep track of how many people are in your environment, you can deploy a people counting analytics. All that data is already pooled. All you have to do is add those compute resources to the storage pool, and you're good to go. So the future with ACI, I see a lot more tools that can potentially be developed to bring seamless management and integration of the infrastructure and the security deployment. We can leverage dashboards in Security Center for preemptive infrastructure troubleshooting. And you can expect a lot more seamless of an experience between the infrastructure level and the security level of a deployment. So that's what I had to talk about. I'm going to pass this back to Scott. Scott, over
Yes,
to you.
David, thank you very, very much for that. So we did get a question right off the gate. And the question from Grant was, are there specific tiers of BCD video storage platforms that Genetec OEMs, or do they offer all different sized BCD platforms?
Today we offer all different size BCD platforms. There's a little bit of a selection that we do in terms of what we think is very specific to Genetec. So we try to make our product line the right product line for Genetec products. But I think we cover pretty much the gamut of the BCD video line.
Very good. I did not see any other questions popping through. That was the only one. So thank you very, very much for that presentation and the insight about how Genetec is looking at this whole world of HCI as it comes into our side of the business.
Yeah, thank you guys very much for having me. It was a pleasure.